A black veteran boards a routine flight home, just another seat in economy, just another day in the sky. But what happens next will ignite a national firestorm. What if the most dangerous thing you could carry wasn't a weapon, but dignity? What would you do if you were pushed, humiliated, and degraded in front of an entire cabin of silent witnesses, simply because of the color of your skin? And what if your calm, your silence, your stillness had the power to shake a billion-dollar company to its core? This is not a story of rage. It's not a viral video for shock value. This is the story of Dr. Elias Monroe, a decorated military veteran who chose restraint over retaliation, empathy over ego, and sparked a movement without raising his voice. The plane took off with 138 passengers. It landed with a nation watching. Are you ready to witness the moment the skies cracked open if you believe in justice, in quiet power, and in the right to simply exist without fear? Like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Right now, let's begin the story. The fluorescent lights of Gate 47B buzzed faintly overhead as passengers filed toward the jet bridge, each carrying some version of anticipation or fatigue. It was late afternoon in Boston, Logan International Airport, and the international terminal hummed with the chaos of casual travelers and seasoned flyers alike. Dr. Elias Monroe adjusted the strap of his leather shoulder bag, worn smooth by decades of travel. In his right hand, he held a dark oak cane, not out of necessity, but as a quiet concession to time. At 60 years old, Elias moved with a deliberate grace. His neatly trimmed silver beard, pressed slacks, and polished shoes spoke of discipline long held and never abandoned. He stepped into the business class cabin of Eureka Airlines Flight 508 to London. A young flight attendant greeted him with a smile neutral, fleeting before turning her full attention to a white couple behind him. Elias didn't flinch. He'd seen the subtle shift in expression more times than he cared to count. He simply offered a polite nod, moved forward, and located seat 3A, a window seat. As he stowed his bag overhead, he felt the presence of someone approaching sharp, assertive. "Excuse me, sir," said a voice behind him. Elias turned. The flight attendant now in front of him was a tall woman in her mid-30s, with platinum blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun and a practiced customer service smile. Her name tag read Riley Cooper. "That's business class," she said, glancing at the seat number. "Yes," Elias replied gently, pulling his boarding pass from the inside pocket of his blazer and handing it to her. "Seat 3A. Her eyes flicked from the pass to his face, then back again. Something in her jaw tightened. "I just needed to check," she said flatly, handing it back. "Enjoy your flight." Elias gave her a slow, knowing smile and eased into his seat. He was used to this. It wasn't about the words. People rarely said the quiet part out loud anymore. It was the tone, the half-second hesitation, the assumption. These were the new uniforms of old prejudices. A few rows ahead, a man in a navy suit dropped heavily into seat 1C. He immediately began a phone call about a merger deal and billion-dollar projections. His voice filled the cabin with brash confidence. Elias recognized the type: aggressive, unfiltered, always reaching for power. The man's name, he'd soon learn, was Logan Hartley, managing partner at a hedge fund that prided itself on disruption. Behind Elias, a slender Korean-American woman in her late 20s slid into seat 4C. She wore simple black jeans, a gray cardigan, and the kind of face that listened more than it spoke. Her name was Maya Kwan, a freelance journalist who specialized in stories most media outlets were too afraid to publish. She made eye contact with Elias, briefly, a flicker of recognition, maybe curiosity, then looked away. Riley moved briskly through the cabin, greeting others with bubbly charm. But when she returned to Elias's row to offer a pre-departure drink, her demeanor shifted again. "Water, coffee, orange juice?" she asked, not looking at him directly. "I'll take water. Thank you." She handed him the bottle as if completing a transaction, then immediately turned her full attention to Logan, laughing at one of his offhand comments and offering him both a drink and warm nuts. Elias uncapped the bottle and took a slow sip. He gazed out the window. The tarmac reflected a sliver of orange sky sunset beginning to bleed into dusk. A part of him felt the familiar buzz of anticipation. He always loved the moment right before takeoff. Suspended, unanchored, clean slate. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a brown leather journal. It was older than most of the passengers on this plane, its corners soft, its pages lined with thoughts he rarely shared. He uncapped his pen, the silver one engraved with the words Colonel Elias Monroe, 3-second medical air evac. A gift from a brother-in-arms who never made it home from Kandahar. The hum of the engines began to grow, and the pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Sam Wexler. Welcome aboard Eureka Flight 508 with service to London Heathrow. Please make sure your seatbelt is fastened, and we'll be in the air shortly." Elias clicked his pen once and began to write. Another sky. Another room full of faces deciding what I am before I speak, but I have no need to convince them. I've learned to let the sky carry the truth. From the corner of her eye, Maya watched him write. Something about his calm unnerved her, a quietness that didn't feel like surrender. It felt like warning. 20 minutes after takeoff, Flight 508 had settled into its smooth hum over the Atlantic. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow, and flight attendants began gliding through the aisles with silver carts. The scent of reheated meals, freshly brewed coffee, and lemon-scented sanitizers mixed in the air. Elias leaned back in his seat, resting his hands loosely on his cane. His gaze stayed fixed on the clouds outside. His body was in the sky, but his mind had retreated inward, wandering corridors lined with names, dog tags, battlefield evacuations, and folded flags. Across the aisle, Riley Cooper moved mechanically through the service routine. She handed wine to a couple in 2B and 2C, chuckled politely at a joke from Logan Hartley in 1C, and smiled brightly at a teenage boy in 4A. When she reached Elias's row, the smile dimmed again. She didn't kneel to speak as she had with others. She didn't offer meal options. She simply asked chicken or pasta. Her tone was curt, no menu, no explanation. Elias paused. "What's the sauce on the pasta?" She blinked. "It's white sauce." "Is it cream-based?" he asked evenly. "I suppose so," she replied. "It's just the regular one. I'll take the chicken, then, thank you." She set the tray down in front of him with a quick, perfunctory motion. A small clatter echoed as the utensils shifted. Then she moved on without a word. Across the aisle, Maya Kwan raised an eyebrow. She'd watched Riley offer detailed options to every other business-class passenger. She had overheard her say, "The pasta is a rigatoni with truffle cream, and the chicken is rosemary grilled with garlic mash." But none of that for Elias. Maya scribbled something in her notebook. Elias began eating quietly. The chicken was fine, overcooked, a bit dry, but it wasn't the food that left a bitter taste. It was the performance, the difference, the persistent message between lines. "You don't belong here." He didn't respond, not with anger, not even with a look, just silence. a silence so deep it became a mirror, one Riley couldn't stop glancing into. Maya leaned slightly toward the aisle, whispering just loud enough. "Do they always treat veterans like this?" Elias turned to her, caught the glint in her eye, part empathy, part provocation. "I don't think she knows," he replied quietly. "Knows what Maya asked? That I've flown more miles in evacuation choppers than she's served glasses of Chardonnay," he said. His voice wasn't sharp. It was measured, full of worn dignity. Maya smiled. "Mind if I quote you?" He shook his head gently, returning to his meal. Off the record for now, Logan Hartley, who'd been half listening, turned with amusement. "Wait, you're military?" he asked, eyes scanning Elias up and down. "I was," Elias answered, keeping his gaze level. "Huh," Logan said. "Didn't expect that. No offense, just figured you for one of those retired professors. You've got that quiet, intellectual look." Elias gave a half smile. "We're not mutually exclusive." Logan laughed. "Fair. So what was your gig? Combat intel, combat medicine, air evacuation, 20 years, Afghanistan, Iraq, Africa." Logan's tone shifted slightly. "Damn. Respect." But the respect didn't land like he thought it would. Elias offered a nod, then turned his attention back to the window, silently signaling the conversation was over. Meanwhile, Riley continued moving up and down the aisle. But something about Elias's composure unnerved her. It wasn't just his calm, it was how many others seemed to take quiet notice. She didn't know who he was, but people were looking at him differently now. She returned with dessert, a choice of tiramisu or fruit plate. "Would you like one of these?" she asked Elias, her voice stiff. He turned, surprised at the question. Her tone was guarded, like someone forced to give a peace offering. "I'll pass." "Thank you," Elias said politely. As she walked away, Elias glanced at Maya and whispered, "That wasn't kindness. That was self-preservation." Maya nodded slowly. People always sense when they've misjudged power. Flight 508 pressed eastward, slicing through soft ribbons of twilight cloud. Somewhere over the Atlantic, the sky was a still canvas of navy and gold. The passengers were lulled into silence, some napping, others scrolling or lost in books. And then there was Elias Monroe, silent and still, but not sleeping. He sat with his seat upright, a paperback resting open on his lap, though he hadn't turned a page in 15 minutes. Maya Kwan had returned to her notebook. Occasionally, she glanced at Elias scribbling phrases, drawing connections, sensing there was a bigger story buried here, one that deserved to be told right. And in the back galley, Riley Cooper simmered. Her earlier exchanges with Elias had felt exposed. It wasn't just his calm, it was how others had begun noticing. She could feel Maya's eyes, Logan's sideways glances, even the co-pilot nodding politely to Elias when walking past. Riley didn't know who he was, but the man clearly carried weight, and she didn't like how it made her feel. So when she emerged again to check seat belts and trays before the descent phase, she chose to reassert control. That need, subtle but sharp, manifested itself when she approached Elias Monroe's row again. He had adjusted his seat slightly, his cane propped carefully beside his leg. Riley stopped in front of him. "Sir," she said crisply, "your cane needs to be stowed." Elias looked up, puzzled. "It's secured against my leg, not blocking the aisle. FAA regulations require all personal items be placed completely under the seat." He met her eyes. "This is a medical cane. I may need it during landing. I've flown dozens of times with it in this exact position." Riley's jaw stiffened. "It's a safety violation." Then I'd like to speak with the purser, Ilya said calmly. Riley's voice rose slightly. There's no need for that. Sir, just follow the rules. Maya looked up. Logan turned from across the aisle. A few passengers in nearby rows stirred. The mood shifted. Riley felt it, but plowed forward anyway. She reached down toward the cane. Elias' hand moved instantly, intercepting hers not with aggression, but firmness. His voice didn't rise. If anything, it softened. Don't touch what doesn't belong to you. The air tightened. Riley recoiled slightly, blinking. Then, without thinking, she stepped back and announced loudly enough for Rose to hear, You're being confrontational. Sir, if you don't comply, I will have to escalate this. Elias raised an eyebrow. Are you seriously threatening me for asking to speak with a supervisor? I'm following protocol? No, he said, his voice as calm as still water. You're following a narrative. The one where a tall black man with authority is automatically seen as a threat. There was no venom in his tone, no rage, just truth. And it rattled Riley more than shouting ever could. Before she could respond, the purser, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and decades of experience, emerged from the galley. Is there a problem here? She asked gently. Riley spun, catching her breath. The passenger refuses to stow his cane. He's impeding safety procedures. The purser turned to Elias. Sir, may I ask, do you have a medical need to keep your cane accessible? I do, Elias replied, voice steady. And I've flown over 70 times post-retirement with this cane, exactly as it is. The purser glanced down. The cane was aligned neatly, tucked beside Elias's leg, away from the aisle. That seems fine, she said to Riley. Let's allow him to keep it in position for now. No obstruction here. Riley opened her mouth, closed it, swallowed her retort. The purser nodded to Elias and turned away. Riley stayed frozen, eyes darting briefly to the passengers, now fully watching. Maya broke the silence. Would it be inappropriate to say you handled that better than most diplomats I've met? Elias allowed himself the barest smile. It's not the first time I've had to navigate a battlefield in a three-piece suit. The hush that followed the confrontation felt heavier than turbulence. Conversations dipped to whispers, and the usual hum of cabin white noise seemed to fade beneath an unspoken awareness. Something had shifted. Lines had been crossed. Witnesses had been marked. Elias Monroe adjusted the collar of his blazer and settled back in his seat, cane still upright beside his leg. He didn't feel victorious. This wasn't a win. It was survival. Again. Maya Kwan leaned over from the next row. Do you mind if I ask something off the record? He tilted his head, granting her permission. Why didn't you report her right there? You had every right. Elias's gaze drifted to the curve of the overhead bins. Because I've lived long enough to know that being right doesn't always make you safe. And sometimes, the story matters more if it unfolds fully. Maya scribbled those words as soon as he said them, not because they made a sound bite, but because they felt true in her bones. Then Elias quietly reached into his inner jacket pocket, pulling out a sleek black phone. He tapped twice. No dramatics, no flourish. Just a quiet call. Hello, Greg. It's Monroe. You're going to get a call in the next hour from the CEO's desk. I'd appreciate it if you loop me in as soon as you do. He ended the call without identifying the airline or the reason. He didn't need to. Maya watched, fascinated. You didn't even say what happened. I don't need to. My record and reputation speak for me. She blinked. Greg, as in Gregory Sharp, CFO of Eclipse Holdings. Elias nodded, smiling faintly. "One of my former West Point students. There's a reason I don't raise my voice. I just raise my contacts." He leaned back, but the weight of that small gesture, so understated, so dangerous in its calm, lingered. Meanwhile, in the galley, Riley Cooper paced. Her heart was pounding. Not because she'd been corrected, she'd been in tough customer service situations before, but because this time, something felt off. She'd seen something in the way the purser had deferred to that man, the way passengers looked at him, and the journalist scribbling notes nearby. She pulled out her phone, logged into the crew Wi-Fi, and began searching passenger names. No one notable in seat 3C. She tried variations. Monroe. Elias Monroe. The results made her stomach drop. Colonel Dr. Elias Monroe. Retired Army Surgeon General. Harvard MD. Civil Rights Advisor. Former Deputy Undersecretary of Veterans Affairs. Currently a private equity partner and advisory board member of multiple Fortune 500 companies, including Eureka Airlines' parent investor group. Riley stared at the screen, her lips parting slowly. A lump formed in her throat. She hadn't just pushed a high-profile veteran. She had tried to belittle one of the most influential black men in modern aviation investment, on a flight he partly owned, and he hadn't even flexed. Back in the cockpit, the purser, Karen Delgado, had already discreetly alerted the captain. "Just be aware. Something happened in row 3. It's being handled, but if this goes public..." The captain sighed. "Let's land this bird cleanly. We'll debrief on the ground, back in first class." Logan Hartley tapped Elias's arm. "Hey, man, I didn't know who you were before, but well, that was something. If it were me, I would have lost it." Elias smiled without looking at him. "And that's why it was me." Maya leaned in. "I know you said you don't like attention, but people need to know how often this happens." "They will," Elias replied. "Not from me, but from what they saw, from what they'll say." He looked out the window as the sky dimmed into deep purple. Lights flickered on across the cabin. "I make the call when silence becomes more dangerous than truth." As Flight 508 began its gradual descent into Chicago O'Hare, the city lights below twinkled like a second sky. Inside the cabin, however, the atmosphere was taut with the kind of quiet tension that only truth can provoke. Riley Cooper sat rigid in her jump seat, seatbelt across her lap, hands clammy and fidgeting. The notification had arrived 15 minutes ago. A crew-wide internal communication flagged her for a mandatory debrief upon landing. No explanation, no context. She already knew why. She stared across the cabin toward Elias Monroe, who sat calm, almost serene, one hand resting gently on the top of his cane. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't angry. That's what unsettled her most. His restraint made her feel smaller than his power ever could. She suddenly remembered the stories her father used to tell her about Tuskegee airmen and officers who never raised their voices, even when surrounded by injustice. It wasn't that they weren't angry. It was that they were tired of being expected to prove it. Across the aisle, Maya Kwan reviewed her notes. Her recording app had captured the verbal exchange between Elias and Riley almost word for word, but she hesitated. She wasn't sure if she'd write about this as a breaking story or a reflective essay. The difference, she thought, was subtle but morally significant. Elias Monroe hadn't asked for a headline. He had asked for dignity, and that meant something. After touchdown, the cabin lights brightened. Standard arrival announcements rolled over the intercom, but no one was listening. Not really. Everyone in first class was watching Elias as he calmly gathered his belongings. Just before the seatbelt sign clicked off, a junior flight attendant, Ana Torres, approached with cautious respect. "Mr. Monroe, I just wanted to say I saw what happened, and I'm sorry. You shouldn't have had to deal with that." Elias paused, his expression softening. "Thank you," he said. "That means more than you know." As passengers deplaned, the ripple effect was already spreading. Logan Hartley exchanged numbers with Maya, offering a follow-up quote. Several business-class travelers were asking who Elias was. Even a teenager walking behind them nudged her friend, whispering, "That's the guy the flight attendant snapped at. But he's, important." Inside the terminal, two men in dark suits were waiting at the gate exit. One approached Elias with a subtle nod. "Mr. Monroe, I'm here on behalf of Mr. Sharp. He's on a call with the board right now. They've seen the preliminary report." Elias didn't miss a step. "Good. Let them know I'll be releasing a personal statement by morning." The agent nodded again. "Would you like a car to the hotel?" "No need," Elias replied. "I need the walk." Elsewhere in the airport, Riley was pulled into a private office, met by a supervisor whose face was pale. "We've been informed there's a pending board-level investigation regarding today's flight," the woman said, setting down a printed report. "Effective immediately. You are being placed on administrative leave pending review." Riley opened her mouth, but the supervisor held up a hand. "This isn't about you being bad at your job. It's about how a moment of unchecked behavior became a company liability. You need to understand that we're not just flying planes anymore. We're flying reputations. And this was a crash. At the Hyatt Regency across from the terminal." Elias stood in front of his hotel window, suit jacket draped on the armchair, shirt sleeves rolled. He made a second call, this time to Evelyn Marsh, a civil rights lawyer and longtime friend. "It happened again," he said simply. "She didn't ask where. She didn't need to." "You want this one to go public?" Evelyn asked. "Yes," Elias said, "but not with anger, with precision. I want the public to know that even a decorated veteran one who sits on their investment board is still subject to humiliation at 35,000 feet. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You want to control the narrative? I want to correct it," he replied. "One story at a time." At 6:47 a.m. the next morning, a sleek black car rolled into the executive parking area of Eureka Airlines Chicago headquarters. Inside, Dr. Elias Monroe adjusted the cuff of his navy blue blazer, eyes calm, mind alert. It wasn't just another board meeting. It was a reckoning. The boardroom on the 19th floor was already half full when Elias arrived. The view of Lake Michigan shimmered behind the tall windows, a peaceful contrast to the rising tension in the room. The chairman, Gregory Sharp, stood to greet him, his eyes searching Elias' face for some clue: anger, revenge, maybe fatigue. Instead, Elias offered a measured handshake. "Good morning, Greg." "You sure you're ready for this?" Greg asked. "I've been ready since they handed me a uniform and asked me to represent a country that wouldn't seat me properly on a plane." The room went still. Elias took his seat. As the meeting began, screens lit up with performance charts and legal risk projections. Midway through the agenda, Greg called it, "There's an item not on the original schedule. Dr. Monroe has requested to speak on a matter of personnel conduct and corporate culture." Murmurs circled the room. Elias stood, and then he told them, not in outrage, but with clarity, precision, and detail. He laid out the events of Flight 508 from the moment Riley Cooper approached him to the exact wording of her dismissive tone. He referenced the video evidence, Maya Kwan's recordings, and the silent judgment of bystanders who had witnessed everything but said nothing. "Let me be clear," Elias said, voice unwavering. "I'm not asking for an apology. I'm demanding systemic accountability. If this can happen to someone like me on your board, what happens to those without a title, without a voice, without a platform?" He paused, letting silence settle like dust on marble. "I am not your exception. I am your mirror." That same morning, Riley Cooper sat alone in her apartment. The TV was muted, but headlines were screaming across the ticker at the bottom of the screen. Board member allegedly harassed. By Eureka Airlines staff investigation launched. Black veteran calls out airlines culture after being publicly shamed mid-flight. Her phone vibrated, a text from a former coworker. "You okay? CNN just ran your face." She didn't reply. Instead, Riley pulled open her drawer and took out an old envelope, her acceptance letter into flight training. She remembered how proud she'd been, the first in her family to wear the wings. Back then, she had sworn never to become one of those attendants who forgot the humanity behind each seat number. And now she wasn't sure if she was the villain or just another product of a machine that didn't care who it deformed. Back in the boardroom, the legal team gave their report. Projected brand damage catastrophic. Investor panic already rippling. Within 24 hours, Eureka Airlines stock had dipped 4.2%, a $700 million blow. Greg spoke last. "It's not about salvaging stock anymore," he said. "It's about moral recalibration. And that starts at the top." He turned to Elias. "You'll chair the new Ethics and Equity Oversight Division. You'll build it from the ground up." Elias didn't blink. "I already have," he said. Then he walked out. Outside, the sky had softened into a quiet gray. It wasn't over. Nothing was over. But something had shifted. Not just for Elias, not just for Eureka, but for everyone watching. Because sometimes a man doesn't need to shout to shake the earth. Sometimes silence is the loudest sound of all. In the days following the board meeting, media pressure grew like a thunderstorm stalled over the city. Every major outlet from CNN to independent podcasts picked up the story. But Elias Monroe kept quiet. No public interviews, no social media statements, just a quiet presence and a firm belief real change doesn't begin with noise. It begins with structure. At the same time, Riley Cooper's world unraveled. She'd been suspended pending investigation, escorted out of Eureka HQ without so much as a final debrief. Her badge revoked, her schedule wiped. In the silence of her apartment, she replayed the incident over and over, every word, every choice. At first, she tried justifying her tone. Then she shifted to blame. It was a long shift. She was under stress. He hadn't complied immediately, but the truth gnawed at her. She had looked at a dignified man in a tailored jacket, a man who carried himself with quiet strength, and she'd seen. What a threat, a problem to be moved. Or was it something worse? A reflection of the biases she'd sworn she didn't have. Meanwhile, Elias sat in a cafe near Hyde Park. Across from him sat Maya Kwan, the journalist who had captured the footage now seen by millions. "Why haven't you made a statement?" she asked. Elias stirred his coffee. "Because statements don't fix culture. Structures do." Maya leaned in. "You know what people are saying. Right. That you're too quiet. That if you really wanted justice, you'd be out there." Elias smiled. "Justice that depends on volume fades as soon as the noise dies down. But justice built into policy, that outlives all of us. Maya tilted her head. So what now? He slid a folder toward her. A charter. For airline equity. A formal proposal to be adopted not just by Eureka, but by every domestic carrier. Maya opened it and scanned the first few lines. Her expression shifted. This is bold. It's overdue. He stood. Publish it, if you like. But not as a gotcha. Publish it as an invitation. Elsewhere, Riley Cooper stood on the sidewalk outside the Southside Veterans Center. She hesitated before going in. A sign on the door read, "Respect is not something you demand. It's something you practice. Inside." The receptionist gave her a kind look. "You here for the support group?" Riley nodded. The group met in a modest room with folding chairs and styrofoam cups of lukewarm coffee. A dozen veterans of all backgrounds gathered in a circle. Men and women, young and old, black, white, Latino, Native, and Riley sat down among them, not as a savior, not even as a participant, but as a witness. She didn't speak at first. She just listened to the war stories, the homecoming disappointments, the lost jobs, the misdiagnoses, the ways they'd been seen and not seen. And something inside her cracked open. She had pushed a man who had carried the weight of this country on his shoulders, because she'd never taken the time to understand the load. That night, Elias received an unexpected call. Riley Cooper. He let it ring twice before answering. "Dr. Monroe," she said, voice raw. "I know I don't deserve your time, but I went to a veterans support group today. I sat with them, and I saw what I didn't see that day on the plane." Silence. "I want to be better. I want to undo this." Elias waited a beat, then replied, "You can't undo a moment, but you can build a life that outweighs it." 3 days later, Maya Kwan's article dropped. From Silence to Structure the Veteran, The Flight, and a New Sky for Equality. An exclusive look at how one man's quiet resistance may change aviation forever. And the world listened. The boardroom of Eureka Airlines didn't look the same anymore. The long mahogany table, once filled with indifferent nods and polite dismissals, now bore documents that sparked debate, vulnerability, and most importantly, reflection. At the head sat Gregory Sharp, unusually quiet, reading through the newly proposed Equity Aviation Charter. It was Dr. Elias Monroe's blueprint for cultural reform, but it was more than a policy. It was a roadmap for transformation. Sharp leaned back and studied Elias, who sat at the far end, calm as ever. "You're asking us to strip down every layer of how we operate," Sharp said. "I'm asking you to rebuild from the bones," Elias replied. Across the table, a young black board member, Claudia Pierce, nodded. "This isn't about punishment. It's about prevention, about culture, about rebuilding trust." Sharp placed the pages down. "It's bold," Elias simply said. "So is flight." Once. A silence fell over the room, and then Sharp signed. In a flight lounge across the terminal, Riley Cooper waited. She had no uniform anymore, just jeans and a gray sweater, worn around the elbows. She stared out the glass at the tarmac, where a jet prepared for departure. The lounge TV flickered to a press conference, Eureka Airlines live, and at the podium, Elias Monroe. Not as a victim, but as an architect of change, as of today. Elias spoke calmly. Eureka Airlines is launching the Sky Dignity Protocol, an internal system designed to protect passenger rights and prevent profiling. Every crew member, from gate to cockpit, will be retrained not only in procedure, but in perception. He paused, because no passenger should have to earn their dignity, especially not at 30,000 feet. The room around Riley quieted. A nearby pilot turned up the volume. Two flight attendants stopped mid-conversation. Riley whispered to herself, "I did that." But the words didn't come with pride. They came with purpose. Later that week, Maya Kwan joined Elias on a return flight to Chicago. The airline had offered him first class, of course, but he chose to sit in economy. "You really want to sit here?" Maya asked, setting her laptop in the tray. Elias nodded. "Culture doesn't change from the top. It changes when the top is willing to walk through the middle, midway through the flight." An older black man in the row ahead turned around. "Excuse me, Dr. Monroe." "Yes, I just wanted to say thank you. I've flown 47 years and never felt like someone had our back." "You do?" Ellis nodded, his voice steady. "We all should. I'm just the first to stay in my seat long enough to say it." Meanwhile, in the lower levels of Eureka HQ, Riley found herself in a cramped room with 6 other employees, 4 gate agents, a baggage handler, and a senior flight attendant. Each was there voluntarily. Each had once filed an internal complaint that went ignored. Today, they were advisors to the internal compliance overhaul. "I thought I was coming in to be fired," the baggage handler muttered. Riley chuckled softly. "Me too." The senior flight attendant leaned forward. "So why are you still here?" Riley swallowed. "Because if I leave now, it means the only story I leave behind is the worst thing I ever did. I need to write something better." She looked down at the thick binder labeled Passenger Equity Advisory Group Pilot Program, and she didn't flinch. Across the country, ripple effects began. A retired Air Force colonel penned an op-ed, "If one veteran being humiliated at 38,000 feet can fix what decades of memos couldn't, maybe we need more turbulence." A group of students at Howard University held a mock tribunal examining unconscious bias in service professions. And at a small airport in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a 17-year-old black girl boarded a flight for the first time without gripping the armrests in fear, because she'd read about Elias Monroe. And if someone like him could sit still through judgment and still be dignified, so could she. Back at home, Elias sat with his journal. He wrote, "Change isn't fast. It isn't loud. It doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it looks like a quiet man in a coach seat, choosing to stay put while the world tries to move him. And sometimes that stillness becomes a storm." He closed the book, turned out the light, and let the silence hold him, not as an absence, but as a promise. Inside the Eureka Airlines legal wing nicknamed the Hangar, 2 attorneys stared at the crisis brief again. The lead counsel, Deborah Lane, pinched the bridge of her nose. She'd written dozens of press responses in her career, but never for something this deeply human. "This isn't a liability memo anymore," she told her team. "It's a moral reckoning." Outside the conference room, news continued to ripple. What began with a single phone call was now congressional testimony. Airline bias wasn't just a social debate. It was a line item in federal hearings. In a panel chaired by Senator Linton of Oregon, Dr. Elias Monroe sat under oath. Calm, clear. Senator Linton leaned in, half apologetic. "Dr. Monroe, you don't strike me as a man who enjoys public spectacle." "I don't," Elias said softly. "But silence is its own kind of noise. And for too long. That's all many of us have heard at 35,000 feet. The room grew still. "What would justice look like to you?" the senator asked. Elias folded his hands. "Justice isn't a headline. It's when the next black passenger boards a plane and doesn't feel like a disruption. Just a traveler. At Eureka HQ. Riley Cooper paced alone in the training hangar. No more mirror drills. No rehearsed smiles. Today was raw. She stood before 20 new hires, diverse in race and age. No script, just story. I was the flight attendant on 417 to Charlotte. She began. I made a mistake I'll never be able to erase. The room stiffened. One man shifted uncomfortably in his seat. A young Latina woman's eyes glistened. I profiled a man who deserved respect. I let fear shout louder than facts. Riley continued, "You won't be perfect either, but you'll have a choice. To see people, not assumptions." She let the silence sit, and in that quiet, trust took root. That same evening, at a university symposium on transportation equity, Maya Kwan introduced Elias to the student body. Elias Monroe isn't here because he wanted to go viral. She said, he's here because injustice found him at 38,000 feet. And instead of landing quietly, he stood. Elias walked to the podium and faced the students. I was once told that when people see you in uniform, they see the flag. But sometimes, when that uniform is skin, they only see threat. A student raised her hand. How do you stay calm? Even after what they did, Elias paused. Because rage is a fire. And if I let it burn everything, there'd be nothing left for change to stand on. Back on the tarmac, Claudia Pierce, board member and the new chair of the Passenger Experience Council, met with Elijah Sanders, a longtime baggage handler at Eureka. We're reviewing every ground-level experience now, Claudia said. It starts with how our own employees are treated. Elias smiled. So, now my job finally matters. To corporate. Claudia didn't flinch. It always did. We just didn't have the right ears until now. He shook her hand. Then let's make sure they hear us clearly. Late that night, Elias received a video message from a girl in Georgia. Hi, Dr. Monroe. My name is Alani. I'm 11. I'm scared to fly. But my mom showed me your story, and now I think maybe I'll try. Elias watched it twice, then opened a new journal page. The sky is changing. Not all at once. Not without pain. But if an 11-year-old can find courage because one man stayed seated, then the world just tilted closer to justice. He closed his journal and smiled. Not for what he endured, but for what was becoming possible. The boardroom at Eureka Airlines had never felt this quiet. 10 executives, one long walnut table, and a silence that rang louder than the storm outside the glass walls. Claudia Pierce, now interim CEO, stood at the head of the table, holding a single folder, no PowerPoint, no consultants. Gentlemen, we are not here to discuss damage control, she said, voice low but razor sharp. We are here to address a culture that rotted from within. Some shifted, others stared at their phones, uncomfortable, fidgeting with pens and cuffs. Claudia tossed the folder onto the center of the table. Inside testimonies, photos, flight recordings, passenger complaints, whistleblower emails. I suggest you read every word, she said, because the era of performative apologies ends today. Gregory Shaw, CFO, tried to interject. Claudia, we all feel the weight of the backlash. No, Claudia snapped. You feel the weight of consequence? Elias Monroe felt the weight of restraint while being humiliated in public. She turned toward the window, watching a plane taxi in the rain. We grounded Flight 417 that day, she said. Today, we're grounding an entire philosophy. Meanwhile, in a modest cafe across town, Riley Cooper stirred a cup of black coffee, the bitter steam rising like memory. Across from her sat Naomi Briggs, a senior diversity trainer and retired Air Force captain. I watched the footage again. Naomi said, Your eyes? They weren't hateful. They were scared. Riley nodded slowly. That's what shames me most. That fear can feel so real. It makes you forget who someone else might be. Naomi reached into her bag and handed Riley a worn photo. A younger Naomi, in uniform, arm around a black veteran. My father, she said, fought in Korea. Came home to a country that saluted him on paper and spit on him in person. Riley swallowed hard. You carry shame, Naomi said. Good. Now carry responsibility, because guilt burns fast. But accountability builds bridges across the country in a high school gym in Charlotte. Dr. Elias Monroe stood before rows of students and local veterans. His quiet, composed demeanor never faltered, even when the applause faded into silence. A student stood up. Dr. Monroe, what kept you from snapping? Elias looked at the bleachers and then at his hands. Discipline, he said. I trained for decades to protect this country. That training didn't stop when the war did. It kept me from becoming what they already assumed I was. A veteran clapped slowly. Then others joined. Not loud, but steady. Later, a local mother approached him with tears in her eyes. Her son had nearly dropped out of ROTC after watching the video. He said, What's the point of wearing the uniform if they'll never see past my skin? Elias looked her in the eye. Tell him we wear the uniform so we can hold the system accountable to the ideals it claims to protect. That same night, social media lit up with the breaking news. Breaking Eureka Airlines board dismisses 4 senior executives. Following internal bias probe, new CEO Claudia Pierce announces mandatory civil rights history curriculum for all staff. The reaction was electric. Some cheered. Others jeered. The echo chambers buzzed. But something deeper stirred a conversation that had lived only in whispers, now spoke with volume. Meanwhile, in a quiet room in DET, Senator Linton reviewed a new policy proposal, the Passenger Protection and Equity in Air Travel Act. In the margin, he scribbled a name beside the bill's title, the Monroe Provision. Back at his apartment, Elias sat on his porch, listening to a storm roll in. He didn't smile, but his face was calm. His phone buzzed. A text from Maya Kwan. You started something you may never see the end of, but you changed the direction. That's legacy. He looked out at the clouds. Not all turbulence needed fear. Some turbulence, he realized, meant change was finally in the air. It had been 3 weeks since the incident, but for Dr. Elias Monroe, time didn't feel like healing. It felt like illumination. Everywhere he went now, people approached him not with pity, but with quiet reverence, not the loud, performative kind, the kind you earn by standing still while the world tries to move you. Today, Elias walked through the jet bridge at Boston Logan International Airport. But this time, he wasn't boarding alone. He had been invited officially to address Eureka Airlines' newly trained flight crew. The same company that had once allowed him to be shoved aside now gave him the floor. At the terminal gate, a tall woman stood waiting Claudia Pierce, CEO. She extended her hand without hesitation. Dr. Monroe, thank you for coming. He took her hand, firm but warm. Thank you for calling. Inside the crew training room, 50 flight attendants sat in neat rows, some fresh out of school, others with decades in the sky. All had watched the video. Most had watched the aftermath. Elias took no podium. He simply stood before them. I don't want to be remembered for being humiliated, he began. I want to be remembered for staying human. He paused, watching their eyes. You will fly thousands of people in your careers. Some will be rude. Some will be scared. Some will look like me, and you'll be tempted by media, by memory, by miseducation, to make assumptions. He held up a copy of the U.S. Constitution, worn and flagged. I fought for this, he said, not just for myself, for everyone, including you. Silence, deep, attentive silence. He left them with a question. When your training collides with your instinct, which one will you trust? Later, at a cafe near the terminal, Riley Cooper stirred her coffee again, black, no sugar, no cream. She'd just finished day 7 of the new program, which Naomi Briggs had personally helped design. It wasn't easy. They didn't sugarcoat history. They didn't pretend the skies had ever been fair to everyone. But it was real. Across the table, Naomi nodded slowly. You stayed? That matters. Riley exhaled. Every time I put the uniform back on, I feel like it weighs a little more. Not because of shame, because of purpose. Naomi smiled. Welcome to the real work. You're not here to be perfect. You're here to be accountable. Riley thought back to Elias, his stillness, his dignity, the impossible calm in his voice. What if I can't ever forgive myself, she asked. Naomi leaned forward. Then forgive him for you, and pay that debt forward. Back in Eureka Airlines' legal department, things were shifting fast. Senator Linton's new Passenger Equity Act had passed the preliminary committee, a provision, now dubbed the Monroe Clause, mandated body cam footage on all crew interactions involving escalated enforcement. It also required historical bias training, not just corporate HR fluff, but mandatory coursework co-developed by universities and civil rights organizations. Meanwhile, board members formerly silent were now publicly praising Claudia's reforms. Shareholders, too, were returning not because they forgot the scandal, but because they respected the direction. One wrote on a public forum, they lost 700 members because of silence. They earned back trust through volume. In Charlotte, Elias sat at his kitchen table with his grandson, Miles, who was building a paper plane out of homework. Pop, are you famous now? The boy asked. Eyes wide, Elias chuckled. I'm not famous. I'm remembered. Is that better? Elias paused. A little. It means someone saw what I did and learned something. Miles nodded. Then I want to be remembered too. Elias leaned down, his voice soft. Then do something that matters, even when no one's watching. The next time Elias boarded a plane, it was quiet. No one recognized him. No one flinched. The flight attendant, young, black, with a nervous smile, looked him in the eye and said, Welcome aboard, sir. Thank you for flying with us. He returned the smile, not because everything had changed, but because something had started to. It was a cool spring morning in Washington, D.C., when the final vote passed. The Passenger Equity Act, nicknamed the Monroe Bill, cleared the Senate with a surprising bipartisan majority. The news ticker scrolled across airport screens nationwide. New law mandates accountability standards for all airline crews, including camera footage, bias training, and customer rights protections. At the bottom of the screen, a quiet note inspired by the testimony of Dr. Elias Monroe. Elias didn't watch the news that morning. He was already seated in row 3A of an Eureka Airlines flight to Seattle. No first class, no special treatment, just him, a window, and the silence he'd come to treasure. Riley Cooper, in uniform again, stood at the front of the cabin during boarding. Her badge now included a small silver ribbon issued to all crew who'd completed the new ethics program. She caught Elias's eye, and for the first time since that terrible day, she approached him without fear. May I? She asked. He nodded. She knelt slightly beside his seat. I can't undo what happened. But I want you to know I've stayed. Not to run, but to grow." Elias studied her. No script, no PR language, just a person, trying. "That," he said quietly, "is how we start again." They shook hands, no cameras, no applause, just quiet understanding between two people once broken by a system, but not defined by it. On the flight, Elias stared out the window. The clouds were the same soft, infinite, indifferent to politics or prejudice. But something inside him had shifted. He remembered the weight of the uniform he once wore, the camouflage, the ribbons, the quiet sacrifice that didn't make headlines, and he thought about how, even unarmed, he had found a way to fight again, not with fists or fury, but with stillness, with dignity. At 38,000 feet, somewhere over Ohio, a young boy passed by with his mother. The child stopped suddenly. "Are you the man who stood up without standing up?" he asked. Elias blinked. "I suppose I am." The boy grinned. "That's what my dad says. He says you flew higher on the ground than some people do in a plane." Elias smiled gently, holding back emotion. "Tell your dad I appreciate that." The boy saluted clumsily. Elias returned it with precision. When the plane landed, no one rushed to exit. There was an odd quiet in the cabin, a moment suspended in something more meaningful than travel. As Elias walked up the aisle, passengers nodded at him, not in a celebrity way, in a shared human experience kind of way. At the exit, Claudia Pierce stood waiting again. She'd flown in for a board meeting, but had stayed to greet him. This time, she didn't speak. She just stepped aside, hand over heart. He nodded and continued on. The story would live on not as a scandal, but as a shift. Training manuals were rewritten. Case studies featured his image, not the moment he was shoved, but the moment he stayed calm, the moment he reached for compassion instead of vengeance. Eureka Airlines now led the industry in employee ethics. Other companies followed suit, not because of shame, but because it made sense to do right and be seen doing right. And somewhere in the quiet of a hangar, someone printed a small plaque and bolted it beside a jump seat in the crew quarters of Flight 329, the plane where it all began. The sky remembers. So do we. Dedicated to Dr. Elias Monroe. 1 year later, Elias stood in front of a lecture hall at Howard University, speaking to aviation students, policy researchers, and veterans alike. People often ask me what changed. He said, "It wasn't the law. It wasn't the money. It was the realization that in a world full of noise, quiet courage can still echo." He looked out at the students. History doesn't begin with power. It begins with presence. And in that room, no longer a cabin, but still a vessel, his words flew. Not every battle is fought with fists. Sometimes, the strongest thing a person can do is stay seated. Dr. Elias Monroe didn't want headlines. He wanted peace. But when peace was stripped from him at 38,000 feet, he stood without ever standing up. His story reminds us that dignity is not a privilege. It's a birthright. That silence in the face of injustice isn't always weakness, it's a strategy. And that sometimes, the quietest voices leave the loudest echoes. We end this story not with revenge, but with reflection. But we must also ask, why did this happen in the first place? Why do systems still allow discrimination to board quietly and fly undetected? And how many Elias Monroes fly beside us every day, unseen? If this story moved you, if it made you think, made you feel, or made you uncomfortable, then don't look away. Let's turn emotion into action. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. and subscribe for more true stories that challenge, inspire, and awaken. The sky remembers, and now you do too. See you in the next one